In the highlands of Malawi, in the dust-scattered villages of Palwal, India, and across thousands of kitchens stretching from sub-Saharan Africa to Southeast Asia, a quiet revolution was supposed to begin. It came in the form of a small, sleek, almost futuristic-looking device. A stove. But not just any stove. The Philips HD4012 Woodstove was engineered to be the answer to one of the deadliest, most overlooked humanitarian crises on the planet. For the 2.3 billion people who still cook every meal over an open flame, breathing in smoke that the World Health Organization links to 3.2 million deaths each year, this little cylinder of stainless steel and lithium-powered fans was meant to be salvation. It was the most celebrated clean cookstove ever built. By 2018, Philips had walked away from it entirely. To understand what happened, you have to understand what this stove actually was, what it actually did, and why, despite achieving numbers no one had ever achieved before, it ended up pushed into the corner of kitchens across the developing world, while the same 3 stone fires it was supposed to replace burned on, day after day, exactly as they had for thousands of years. The Philips HD4012 was not a humble piece of equipment. It was a gasifier. Inside its compact combustion chamber, biomass was not simply burned, it was superheated until it released combustible gases, and those gases were ignited by a precisely controlled stream of air pushed by a fan powered by an internal lithium battery. The result was something close to magic. The stove could take twigs, pellets, agricultural waste, rice husks, corn cobs, almost any dry biomass a rural household could scavenge, and turn it into combustion, so clean it approached the cleanliness of liquefied petroleum gas. Liquefied petroleum gas was the gold standard, the fuel-rich households used. And here was a stove burning sticks performing nearly as well. Headlines called it a miracle. The Clean Cooking Alliance held it up as a model. Climate technology publications celebrated it. For a brief electric moment, it seemed like the chronic, smoky, lethal kitchens of the global poor were about to be transformed. The lab numbers, when they came in, only deepened the excitement. Independent researchers in Palwal, India, and rural Malawi began testing the stove in real homes. PM 2.5, the fine particulate matter that lodges deep in human lungs and causes pneumonia, lung cancer, and heart disease, was cut by 66 to 78% compared to a 3-stone fire. Carbon monoxide, the silent killer that fills smoky kitchens with each meal, dropped between 55 and 62%. The thermal efficiency of the stove in laboratory conditions exceeded 40%, the highest ever recorded for a wood-burning device of any kind. Fuel consumption fell to roughly a third of what an open fire required. Soon, the press was rounding the numbers up. 90% emissions reduction, 95% less fuel. The Philips HD4012 became the reference stove for an entire industry, the device against which every other clean cookstove would be measured. The story seemed to write itself. We had cracked it. Then a team from the University of California, Berkeley, working with environmental health engineering, decided to do something the celebratory press had not bothered to do. They went into the homes. They installed temperature sensors on the stoves themselves and on the traditional 3-stone fires that sat next to them, and they let those sensors run, not for a week, not for a month, but for 200 days. What they recorded over those 200 days was a slow, agonizing, almost invisible betrayal. In the first weeks of the study, families used the new Philips stove enthusiastically. By the second month, usage began to dip. By the third month, the temperature sensors on the 3-stone fires showed those traditional fires burning at full intensity, every day, exactly as they had before the intervention. The Philips stove was still being used, but only sometimes, for certain dishes, for specific moments. The phenomenon had a name. Researchers called it stove stacking. And stove stacking did something devastating to the math. When you average a clean stove and a dirty stove together, the dirty stove dominates the emissions profile almost entirely. All of those 78% reductions in PM 2.5, all those carbon monoxide drops, were quietly erased in real kitchens, replaced by reductions that, when honestly measured, landed somewhere between 20 and 50% at best. So what happened? Why would families abandon a stove that was, by every laboratory metric, dramatically better than what they had used for generations? The first answer was, simply, electricity. The Philips HD4012 was designed for off-grid villages, the very places where the reliable power needed to recharge its lithium battery did not exist. A stove built for households without electricity required electricity to function. When the battery failed, the careful airflow that made the gasification work stopped, and the stove became less efficient than the basic mud stoves people had built for centuries. The second answer was fuel. The stove worked best on prepared pellets, dense uniform biomass that burned cleanly and consistently. But the supply chains for pellet fuel, the rural distribution networks needed to get those pellets to remote villages at prices poor households could afford, simply never materialized. Families could gather sticks. They could not buy pellets that did not exist in their market. But the deeper failures were not technical. They were cultural, and they were the failures that lab engineers in the Netherlands could never have predicted. The traditional cooking pots used in rural India and Malawi were enormous, blackened, often hand-thrown clay vessels that did not fit cleanly on the small, precise combustion chamber of the Philips stove. Cooking rhythms mattered too. Rural cooks did not light a fire and walk away. They adjusted flame intensity constantly, pushing wood in, pulling it out, controlling heat with the kind of intuitive feedback loop that a sealed, fan-driven gasifier simply could not provide. And then, there were the things almost no one in the West thought about at all. The smoke from an open fire, despite its toll on human lungs, repelled mosquitoes and insects from the kitchen. It cured the thatched roofs of village homes, keeping them waterproof and resistant to termites. The smoke was not just a byproduct of cooking. It was an architectural element, a pest control system, a piece of cultural infrastructure woven into how rural homes had been built for centuries. When you took the smoke away, you took something else with it, and the families who lived in those homes understood this in ways researchers in Eindhoven did not. By 2018, the conclusion was unavoidable. Philips, one of the largest electronics conglomerates on Earth, quietly exited the cookstove business. They recommended their customers transition to a competitor, a company called Mimimoto. The reasons were not mysterious. Distribution costs in the last-mile geographies of rural Africa and Asia could not be recouped. The price points that poor households could realistically afford did not cover the cost of moving a manufactured device to their doorstep. Even Mimimoto and other successor stoves struggled to maintain field operations. The economics had never closed. The stove that had been celebrated as a model had quietly become a cautionary tale, and the company that built it walked away. But the story was not over, because behind every clean cookstove deployment in the developing world, there had been a financial engine, and that engine was carbon credits. The premise was elegant. If a household replaced an open fire with a cleaner stove, the resulting reduction in fuel use translated into avoided carbon emissions, and those avoided emissions could be sold as offsets to corporations and governments looking to balance their carbon books. Cookstove credits became one of the largest categories of carbon offsets on the global market. They subsidized programs that gave stoves to poor households. They funded the entire clean cooking industry. And in 2024, that engine collapsed. Annalise Gill-Wheel and her colleagues at Berkeley published a study examining cookstove offset markets, and they found that the credits had been overcredited by 9 to 10 times on average. The reductions that companies were claiming on paper bore little resemblance to the reductions actually happening in kitchens. In October of that same year, the chief executive officer of Sequest Capital, one of the largest cookstove offset firms in the world, was indicted for fraud. By 2025, the Integrity Council for Voluntary Carbon Market formally rejected the two main cookstove crediting methodologies. The financial structure that had kept clean cookstoves moving into rural homes evaporated almost overnight. What is left, in the aftermath, is a lesson that goes far beyond stoves. The Philips HD4012 was not a bad piece of engineering. It was an extraordinary piece of engineering. The lab numbers were real. The 40% thermal efficiency was real. Under controlled conditions, with prepared pellet fuel, with a charged battery, with a cooperative pot, this device did exactly what its designers said it would do. The failure was not in the metal or the fan or the battery. The failure was in the assumption that a device that wins the lab will automatically win the kitchen. It will not. Tier 5 efficiency ratings, the highest classifications awarded by international clean cookstove standards, mean nothing if the device sits unused in a corner while the family cooks dinner on the same fire their grandparents used. The 95% fuel reduction headlines were a peak measurement under perfect conditions, achieved in moments that did not generalize. Real-world reductions, when adjusted for stove stacking, for battery failure, for fuel scarcity, for cultural mismatch, were a fraction of the laboratory promise. The deeper truth is that household air pollution still kills 3.2 million people every year, and this problem has not been solved. The Philips story is sobering precisely because it reveals how badly the conventional approach failed, even when the engineering was world-class, even when the funding was generous, even when the intentions were sincere. The mistake was treating a kitchen as a thermodynamic system rather than a cultural one. It was assuming that a smarter combustion chamber could substitute for understanding why a family cooks the way they cook, what they expect from a fire, what their pots demand, what their roofs need, what their economy can sustain. It was ignoring anthropology, ignoring supply chains, ignoring the human incentives that govern what actually happens when a stranger from across the world hands you a stove and asks you to change a tradition older than your village. A stove that wins the lab can still lose the kitchen every single time. And until the people designing the next generation of clean cookstoves accept that lesson in full, the smoke will keep rising, the lungs will keep darkening, and somewhere a sleek, fan-driven gasifier with a dead battery will keep gathering dust in the corner, while the three-stone fire next to it burns on, exactly as it always has.